and welcome to another Diplo's webinar on internet governance related topics. This time we've chosen cybersecurity. It's unfortunately constantly hot topic these months. We're seeing a number of incidents. We're seeing also some bilateral relations between the governments. We are seeing, luckily, also the multilateral processes negotiating the cyber norms and the norms of behavior of the states in cyberspace. We are seeing the dialogue on confidence building measures. Next week in Geneva there will be another or second meeting of the UN group of governmental experts discussing cyber norms as well. In general, what we are seeing is that, or what we know is that traditionally security discussions have been led within the kind of intergovernmental environment, and maybe cyber is something that shows us that there is a need for involvement of other stakeholders. That's quite a paradigm shift when it comes to security, and we saw a number of private sector initiatives when it comes to cybersecurity, but there is one particular which directly dives into the dialogue on norms, cyber norms and behavior of states, and that's the one from Microsoft. Microsoft came ahead last year with a set of proposed norms for state behavior. So that is something quite interesting and a change in the international relations, seeing a corporate sector actually stepping in the dialogue among the states and in a way telling them what they could do or what they should do. Besides, it seems like in most of the discussions about cyberspace that the role of the private sector and also civil society, academia, technical community needs to be quite specific, and that they should also be involved in the dialogue. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today, Angela McKay. She's the Director of Cybersecurity Policy and Strategy, Global Security Strategy and Diplomacy team at Microsoft. I must say that I was, first time when I saw the title in Microsoft of this department, that I actually have department for diplomacy. It's not public policy only, but diplomacy. I don't know, Angela, if this is the only case in the private sector, but it's certainly an interesting development. Before I pass the floor to Angela, just a brief reminder for those that might be new to Diplo's webinars. Webinar will take an hour. Within the first 20 minutes or so, we'll have the guest speaker make an introductory statements and a kind of introduction into the topic. And afterwards, we'll go on with the questions and answers back and forth to the dialogue. You're all most welcome to post your questions through the chat window at any point, so you can wait until the guest finalizes the presentation, but you can also do it during the presentation. Simply post the questions in the chat window, and I'll try to reflect most of these questions, maybe sum them, group them, and so on, and pass back to Angela to discuss it further. One remark finally is that the webinar, as always, will be recorded, so in case you want to be sure to take care of what you're putting in the chat, you may consider that. There will be a recording of the webinar available in a few days. Okay, I'll stop here, and I'm passing the floor to Angela, so the floor is yours, and I'll get back to some tricky questions afterwards. Go ahead, Angela.
Thank you, Vlad, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to each of you. I know we have a lot of folks from different time zones on the line, and I am very appreciative of you all taking some time to have a discussion with me about the role of cybersecurity norms in helping to maintain and improve stability of cyberspace and maintain and improve the trust in the information and communications technology that is underpinning our global economy and our globally interconnected society. Vlad already did an introduction of me, so I'll go ahead and move forward. But as I'm moving forward, I'll just say I've had the opportunity to be involved in the cybersecurity norms conversation for the better part of 5 years. And in that time, we've seen a lot of evolution in this space. In the beginning, there was a lot of discussion of should there be a multi-stakeholder role in a conversation on international security that, as Vlad noted, had historically been focused on states. And in many ways it appears that we've evolved past that. There are numerous government experts recognizing the importance of not just the private sector, but private sector, academia, and civil society in contributing to this problem space, simply because there are a lot of conflicting and competing interests, and the types of expertise that are needed in this problem space are very diverse. I'll talk a little bit about the role for the private sector specifically. However, I just kind of wanted to open with that broader chapeau that the conversation has evolved to recognizing a need for some multi-stakeholder input, but at the same time is still trying to figure out kind of how that's supposed to work. This first slide I like to include, I think a lot of people would understand this and we'll do it very quickly, but is ultimately why the norms conversation is very important. As we see, Microsoft sits in the basically broadly across the infrastructure around the world, whether you're talking in major enterprises, in governments, including ministries of defense and intelligence agencies, as well as the consumer space. Our products and services are used ubiquitously around the world. And so what we've seen monitoring the threat environment is that there is a considerable activity in the space of conflict. You know, there is the law of armed conflict that sets out a basic rule set for the expectations and roles of states in conflict. And there are cyber cases that would go up there, but the vast majority of activity we've seen, arguably some would say everything, has been below the law of armed conflict. And that is a space where norms can be helpful in terms of setting expectations for behavior and defining acceptable and unacceptable behavior in this space. So just as a quick kind of context for a little bit of how we see government's role and how it's affecting both industry and innovation. And sometimes people don't necessarily think about this one, which is government it has a lot of different conflicting and complementary roles relative to cyberspace. First of all, they're a very large user of information and communications technology, and so they care a lot about it being maintained and well protected. They are protectors of national security and public safety, and that has a role in thinking about how to fulfill those missions relative to cyberspace. They are also exploiters of cyberspace to fulfill their national security and public safety responsibilities, and they like a lot of data to do their jobs. They like to monitor what's going on in the environment. Sometimes those roles may be in conflict with each other. Sometimes as a user, a government may want, for example, a particular vulnerability to be patched. However, as an exploiter, they might want to use that vulnerability in the service of a national security function. So there are just different equities across every government when you're thinking about engaging in cybersecurity itself and in cyber norms specifically. Some of what we see, and I think the data to the right is kind of interesting, is that we see governments improving both their defensive and developing offensive capabilities relative to cyberspace. You can see the numbers there, over 37 countries with increasing offensive capabilities. I think that there's a sense of insecurity on a global basis, and in that context, governments seek to ensure they can protect themselves and their citizens. At the same time, governments are also asking for increases of security. 95 or more countries developing legislative initiatives and many with new strategies. What you can see there is that there is this rising insecurity in the international domain, and at the same time increasing pressures for enterprises to improve security. I think there's an interesting paradox there, and we've got to find a really healthy balance, because if you continue to have these forces pressing against each other, it really starts to challenge the innovation landscape that has brought us to the place that we're at now. So why, as Vlad noted, is Microsoft actually speaking to cybersecurity norms in a space that has historically been primarily the context or in the domain of governments? You know, I think really the middle green box is just kind of states this best. Ultimately, we see a distorted threat model facing enterprises on a global basis, and not just ICT enterprises, but rather enterprises across the critical infrastructure domain. So, for example, industry in the current context is oftentimes the target, the vector, and have to clean up the consequences of successful cyber attacks. And what that's causing is very, very complicated response cycles, operational uncertainty. We're having to deal with the reciprocity cost of state actions. And at the same time, and this is where you start to move to a more existential threat, we're facing a loss of trust in products and services. And I think I'll highlight a few examples here because sometimes folks may see it in one light or another, but not all. So when it comes to private sector being a vector for cyber threats, our products and services being misused or exploited for malicious purpose, you could think about, for example, the Stuxnet attacks that used 0 days in the Windows environment and in the Siemens infrastructure, or even more recently with shadow brokers, where they happened to highlight that there had been exploitation of Juniper, Cisco, and Fortinet products to achieve national security goals. When it comes to being the target, we have seen the recent Ukrainian power grid attacks where you had 2 to 3 companies who were subject to nation-state actors. You also have Saudi Aramco and Razgas in the Middle East who were also directly targeted by states. And in the context of reciprocity, one of the most commonly cited areas is the distributed denial of service attacks against the U.S. financial services industry. All of that in combination means that we're dealing with a complex threat environment and increasing cost, and we have a responsibility to ourselves, our shareholders, and our customers to be able to engage constructively with governments and civil society on advancing security and stability in this space. So very briefly on this slide, one of the things that I think can be difficult in this space is there's a lot of very different challenges. There are state norms that apply specifically to limiting or constraining offense in cyberspace. There are norms that are focused on improving defenses in cyberspace. And there's a category of norms that we've proposed, Microsoft has proposed, that is specifically to how industry can take steps forward to complement, support, and enable the norms that apply to states. The reason these 3 categories that are down the left-hand side of this slide are important is because the set of stakeholders that you need to gather for development and in some cases implementation of these categories and norms are different. There is a relatively smaller set, 37 based on the other slide I said earlier, of states who have offensive capabilities. And so they would be particularly important for a conversation on offensive norms. At the same time, when you move into defensive norms, this is a space where organizations such as the Forum for Incident and Security Response Teams may also be able to contribute to the dialogue. And like I said, for industry norms, there is a unique role for ICT companies in helping to complement and support stability in cyberspace. And we're really trying to drive that conversation forward. This slide is not particularly easy to read on the webinar, but I'll give a very brief overview here. Basically, in December of 2014, Microsoft proposed a set of 6 norms specific to suggesting acceptable and unacceptable behavior for states in cyberspace. You can see that on the left-hand side of the slide. Some of those norms had to do with things, for example, supply chain security, handling of vulnerabilities. Some of them had to do with preventing mass events, kind of the typical critical infrastructure context. And then also some of the norms we proposed had to do with how you bring together capabilities to respond to complex events in cyberspace. You know, one of the major criticisms that first of all, the norms that we proposed were received actually quite well. It was immediately before the 2015 UN group of government experts got to the detailed parts of their conversations, and numerous officials highlighted that they felt like it was a constructive addition to the dialogue. And that's ultimately what we were trying to do. We didn't expect that the norms would be taken up and codified by anyone in particular, but rather we were trying to contribute. Because at that point in time, in December of 2014, there were not a lot of specific proposals on the table about what the norms should be, and we were trying to contribute to that. That said, as I highlighted earlier, one of the criticisms that we received was, wow, that's very interesting. The private sector defining or suggesting what states should and should not do? What, Microsoft, are you going to do? What role does industry have here? And so what we did in, I think it was July, might have been June of this year, is we came out with a second paper. It's actually a third paper, but a second paper that started to outline what are some of the norms for the global ICT industry that would be complementary to and supportive of those that we outlined for states. So on this slide, you can see that there's a norm for states and a norm for industry where we see what the two roles are. I think the good example here that really starts to highlight those complementary roles is that Microsoft has advocated that states should have a clear policy for handling of vulnerabilities. People may have heard about this as the vulnerability equities process. So if a government either finds or has a vulnerability reported to them, what do? They hold on to that vuln and use it for national security purposes, or do they report it to the vendor so that the vendor can fix the vuln and address and improve the security of the ecosystem at large? The complementary role for industry is that we need to make sure that we have the appropriate processes for handling vulnerabilities that are reported to us, that we know how to prioritize them, triage them, and ultimately deploy patches to the ecosystem. I'm not going to read all of the examples here. I have a slide at the end that highlights that paper if it's something that you're interested in looking at. But again, the bigger point here is there are ideas for what states should be doing, but industry does have the ICT industry does have complementary roles in helping to improve security and stability. Oh, that slide did not end up looking very good on the the PDF, but I'll explain it anyway. I think you can probably catch it. One of the things that we wanted to highlight here is that there are a lot of different fora that are developing norms. Whether you talk about the Organization for Security and Economic Security and Cooperation, Microsoft's work, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the U.S. government, the UNGGE, the G20, and there's actually many more columns that I could go to the right with ASEAN, ARF, but there are a lot of different proposals on the table for norms. What we wanted to highlight in this slide is that there are actually areas of convergence between these forums, and that's an opportunity for progress. Sometimes things that I hear in the international security space highlight where there are differences between particular governments on philosophical views with regards to cyberspace, and those do exist. At the same time, in order for us to make progress, one of the things we think is really important is highlighting where there are areas of commonality. One of the best examples, if you look at this particular slide, is every single one of the norms proposals on the table including those committed to and codified in the G20, highlight that countries should support law enforcement and investigations of cybercrime on a global basis. That seems to be a norm that is moving from the developmental side into general agreement. At the same time, you also have ones where there don't seem to be as much agreement in this space. So for example, the norm I highlighted on vulnerability handling has not yet really percolated outside of the industry and GGE conversations, is in an area where there may be more progress needed. The last one on this slide before I keep moving is to look at the one that's about protection of IP from economic espionage. This particular norm started in an agreement between the US and China, and it was codified in a bilateral agreement. But then, ultimately, it was then moved into the G20 context and has gotten commitment of all the G20 members to follow it. So it is, again, one of those norms where it's moved just from a proposal into some type of recognition or commitment by states. So when we think about the industry norms piece, I think one of the things people have asked of Microsoft, for example, is kind of who should be involved? Why is this the global ICT industry? And I want to hit that very quickly. We say global ICT industry. Very candidly, there are organizations who have chosen sides in some of the conflict between states. However, those companies like my own that want to operate and do operate on a global basis must engage with governments with parity. We can't treat one better than we treat the other. When I have one state shooting at another state in cyberspace, that's just customer A shooting at customer B. So we are working to improve defenses and limit conflict. The kind of companies that I think would have similar interests, and these are companies that I have conversations with on a regular basis, are platform and infrastructure providers, technology manufacturers like chip makers, router manufacturers, defenders and responders, your security companies, whether you want to talk about Kaspersky in Russia or CrowdStrike in the United States. They're going to have an important role in this space. And the last is assurance organizations. For example, the Common Criteria Testing Labs and or some of those forums that are looking to provide greater assurance in cyberspace. So when we move forward, it is great that there has been progress on the development of cybersecurity norms. But at the same time, the norms as statements themselves do not yet provide the deterrent or risk management function they are intended to provide if they can't be implemented effectively. And that's one of the next series of challenges that the global community is going to have to work on. How to do verification of compliance to norms, and what, if anything, to do when norms are violated. When you look on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that there are a lot of different technical means that can help with attribution of activities or attacks. Whether you're talking about the artifacts left over from forensic investigations of particular successful attacks, the tradecraft involved in the development of malware, and or the particular target selection. There's information underneath a successful attack that can help with attribution. If one can successfully attribute an attack with sufficient confidence, and I'm going to just key in on that point, with sufficient confidence, then you have to decide, what do you do about it? There are cases where a country may decide to say nothing. There are countries where there may be a private accusation, for example, a diplomatic démarche, a statement between an embassy in a particular country. And there can be public accusations, such as when President Obama in the United States publicly called out North Korea for the Sony attacks. Again, this is not necessarily recommending that there is one particular right way, but rather highlighting that for the conversation to move forward and have that risk management and deterrent effect, we're going to need to make progress on both attribution and on the response options available if you can successfully attribute an attack. Vlad, I think I have 2 more slides and then we'll be done, so I think I might be like 5 minutes over. So in the context of the conversation on attribution, in Microsoft's latest proposal, we basically put forward that there's an opportunity and in particular a need for the public and private sectors to work together on attribution. That the private sector oftentimes has deep technical expertise to contribute to a conversation, that any kind of forum like this would need to be geographically diverse. It would need to include technical representatives from the major countries around the world who have offensive capabilities. And ultimately, a kind of third-party forum would help with the attribution challenge because it could provide peer review of the analysis. I'll highlight again the kind of concerns that came out of the Sony attacks because the U.S. affirmatively stated that North Korea had carried out those attacks, but there were questions in the ecosystem about the data the U.S. had used to do that. And unfortunately, because of their concerns about sources and methods and other things, the U.S. said, I have data, but I can't share it with you. And that creates a window of uncertainty. By having a third-party forum for attribution, you would be able to have peer review where even if all the data could not be shared, by having a geographically diverse representation of technical experts, you could start to have confidence in the assessment of attribution itself. So I think this is the last slide here, and I just wanted to highlight that the ecosystem around norms has been quite diverse. As I showed you on the earlier slide, a lot of different multilateral and regional fora have made contributions in this space. And ultimately, moving forward in progress will also require bilateral consultations, regional approaches, international platforms like the GGE, and also, as you can see to the right, we believe there's also an opportunity and conversation to be had around what's the right way to bring a broader multi-stakeholder process into the norms conversation. The quick tag we've called it is G20 plus ICT 20. So thinking about what is the industry complement to the G20 conversation. We're not wedded to that particular idea, but again, the construct is what are the right ways to bring private sector, civil society, to be able to contribute constructively to the conversation on stability in cyberspace. I think, yes, that is in fact my last slide. I want to leave it here with this set of resources that are available that highlight our various papers and contributions in this space. And I think I hand it back over to Vlad to go through what looks like it had been a really active dialogue in the chat window.
Thank you, Angela. It was an excellent overview that you provided. I think you also responded to a number of questions that initially we had, and some reflections from the chat. The chat was really vivid. You can get back to that afterwards, and all of you, because we'll have also the recording of the chat. I was trying to kind of compare what you were talking at the same time, following the great discussion in chat. And there are a couple of, I won't definitely go through each and every question, but I tried to cluster them. And what we had thus far was a couple of tracks of discussions. One was about the vulnerabilities and responsibility, particularly of the business side when it comes to the new products, especially IoT devices and so on. The second track was discussions about the roles of different stakeholders, such as the governments and so on. The third one was discussion about arms, cyber arms, and disarmament, whether it's possible or not, and what does it mean. The next one was a couple of questions about the capacity building and assisting the developing world. And the last one was, no, then we had another one about the process that was quite vivid. So what should the process be? And also the one, very few comments about the norms, about the content. So I'll try to go as much as we can through these tracks. And the first one I'll use, we had a number of questions also from the online course. Diplo just has at this moment the online course on cybersecurity, the regular one. And last week we had a discussion among 15 participants from all over the world on cyber norms and the international humanitarian law and so on. So I'll try to focus firstly on the process, because that's where you ended with your presentation. Then we'll try to go through the others. A couple of reflections there were, the question was for you, how did the government react to Microsoft coming up ahead with norms? Then there was also a question from Christine, how did other private sector entities actually react to your proposals? Nigel mentioned that it would be interesting that the GGE, for instance, kind of co-opt stakeholders such as business, technical community, civil society, so outside of the government delegations. To what extent is that possible, having that it's mainly intergovernmental? And in general, where do you see the venue for the norms that Microsoft or the business sector is pushing? Is it rather the GG, or as you said, G20 plus ICT 20? In the norms, you also mentioned some kind of a model of net mundial for cybersecurity. Is the IGF as kind of a policy shaping mechanism a convenient one? So, or maybe you think that it should go towards the treaty rather than the voluntary norm. So, how do you see the process in these terms?
Okay. Wow, so Vlad, I think that was like 6 questions inside of one bucket. So I'm going to see, I'm going to try and if I can roll through them. And if I miss one, you let me know. So first of all, the reaction of governments to Microsoft's proposal in this space. You know, at first, you know, you had some who were like, wow, you know, industry should stay out of this. This is a governmental conversation. But that was actually fairly limited. In general, I think the general reaction was very favorable in terms of this is a useful contribution to the dialogue. Do I agree or disagree with these norms? I probably don't agree with all of them, but it is important to have a voice from a key leading industry player in this space, and we appreciate that. As we've moved from 2014 into our latest paper here in 2015, I think that the reaction has even become more positive, where we've had states saying they were going to champion particular ideas from our latest contributions. For example, whether it's the Attribution Council or the Forum for Incident and Security Response teams reaching out and saying, hey, we want to work with you on improving defenses and industry norms in this space. The reaction has been pretty positive. Again, if you look at the trend for industry, it's actually fairly similar. In the beginning, there were people who would talk with us, other companies who would talk with us, and be like, we think what you're doing is good, but we can't believe you're doing it. That was more, you know, I can't believe you're telling states what to do. And we were like, no, we're not attempting to tell states what to do. We're trying to contribute to a global discourse. It was intended to be, you know, a contribution to drive progress, not a mandate from industry. In particular, as you move to past the 2015, the success of the 2015 GGE and the G20 and G7 conversation on norms, we're getting a lot more receptivity and outreaches from other players in industry saying they want to contribute on not just industry norms, but on the government norms conversation as well. And that reach out comes from different places around the world, whether it's from companies in China, companies in the US, companies in Israel, companies in India. We're definitely starting to see more interest in this space. And it's not just the global ICT industry. I've also seen, for example, financial institutions who have dealt with a lot of reciprocity attacks being interested in engaging in this space. I think one of the other questions Vlad, was, kind of what is the forum for norms? And I think I'd like to just debunk the idea. I don't believe there is ever going to be a singular forum for the development and implementation of cybersecurity norms. I think what we're going to see is a continuing, almost organic engagement of, like the earlier slide, bilateral conversations, regional agreements like the SCO, and multilateral conversations. I also do not believe we are ultimately at a space where there is enough convergence. If you think about the slides with the dots, there isn't yet sufficient convergence on norms, much less some of the things like how the law of armed conflict applies in cyberspace for there to be a treaty. That is why the conversation on norms and the organic process where they will both be developed and codified in different ways is incredibly important. There just isn't agreement broad enough to move forward with the treaty. I think the IGF can be a particularly useful forum in thinking about some of the capacity building needs in order to help enable countries, their citizens, and their enterprises to engage constructively in the management of security of cyberspace, as well as in the conversation on cyber norms. And notice I said both. That capacity building should not be solely focused on how to get into the norms conversation, but I think more practically should be on, as we're bringing new populations online, how are we ensuring that they have the necessary skills to be able to manage the risk that come at the same time? And how do we prioritize, for example, the establishment of cybercrime laws, the building of capacity with certs to be able to deal with incidents? Those things are incredibly important and help reduce the activities that need to be considered within the norms context. The more we can manage everyday events so that they don't become mass events, the smaller kind of the space for norms is, but that's going to be a collective challenge to society. Vlad, did I get all of those, or at least most of them?
You covered most of them, yeah. I mean, I don't expect that we actually managed to respond to every single question. As I said, the chat will be available later, so if you have time, when you have time, you can go through and maybe get back with some further questions so we can pass them on. But I think all in all, you cover even some of the questions I haven't mentioned, which came later, such as what is the relation of the proposed norms with the OSCE CBM, so Asian CBM initiative and so on. But you basically cover that within a scope of number of different fora that should somehow get harmonized. We can get back to that if we have time later. I would move to the next kind of a chunk of questions, which was huge, and it started with it. The whole discussion in chat started, and you also tackled that, is the kind of responsibility of the corporate sector when it comes to vulnerabilities. Because most of the cyber weapons actually originate based on the vulnerabilities, mainly from cybercrime media as well. So there is a bunch of questions. One was, or comments. One was, I'm trying to see, from Richard Hill related to the IoT devices, where he said, some experts say, we have taken a system built to resist destruction by nuclear weapons and made it vulnerable to toasters. So the question was, could voluntary adopted standards that would be implemented everywhere in the world work? Or do we maybe need to go for some more firm liability for the security of the products that the industry does? Marilia mentioned the hackable t-shirts as an interesting concept in future. Peter mentioned that there should be standards where the networks are, for instance, and the computers, devices, software are scanned against threats and vulnerabilities. And then the question was, since we have the end-to-end principle of the internet, can we actually scan the infrastructure, or we need to scan at the ends? Dragan asked, related to the, in a way, the private role when it comes to jurisdiction, where they're placing, there was a good example that he also mentioned when it comes to Microsoft and the new USG in Ireland case. So sometimes private sector also knows to play with the jurisdictions being here and there. So in a way, to sum up, the question is, how do you see the role and even the liability, or whether there should be a kind of a liability of the corporate sector for the security and delivery of the product, especially with the pace that it goes with the IoT, with the new services faster, cheaper, and so on?
So I'll start with a kind of a characterization of the environment and then move to the question of incentives and disincentives to change behavior in the environment. So if we look back in order to look forward, you can see that there have been at least three kind of major waves, not of innovation, but of technology. There was the first wave of information technology, the second wave of operational technology, so things like control systems that manage processes like manufacturing and production plants. And then what we're in now, and just in the very beginning of, is IoT. And we are in it, though. It's not something that is in the future. It is a world we're living in now that will only increase. I think the number bandied about regularly is 50 billion devices by 2020. And so I will say that I'm definitely concerned as a security professional, and that's what I am. I'm a security professional. I've been in the security field for 15 years with a background in engineering. I'm concerned that we're not taking the lessons learned from the IT world and the operational technology world and rolling them into the IoT world. So the risk landscape is going to be more complex. Now, there are reasons for that that make sense, and then there are reasons for that I think we'll need to make both domestic and international discussions on what kind of risks are tolerable and acceptable and which risks are not. So some of the reasons that it makes sense that IoT is moving very fast is, IoT is not limited to technology, traditional technology companies. You've got everybody from the toaster manufacturer who's writing code to Mattel, who makes the talking Barbie, to medical device manufacturers who are developing code. Development of code is no longer limited to large-scale technology environments. It's occurring in every single industry on a global basis. However, these organizations are not all experts in managing software assurance, reducing the number and severity of vulnerabilities in code. And they may not necessarily have the expertise or the processes to scale that. And so what you see is, devices that have known vulnerabilities being deployed that are not patchable and that don't have even some of the other defense and depth capabilities that are needed. So I do believe that we are dealing with an increasing risk landscape. And there was one other trend I forgot to mention. There's an increasing use of open source on a global basis as well. And so Microsoft is also a big user and contributor of open source. We're actually the second largest contributor to the open source community on a global basis. But the open source development world does not have the same oversight, training, tooling, and rigor that is applied to, for example, a proprietary environment. It's not a pro or a con open source or proprietary software, but really what we have to be thinking about are what are the processes, training, tooling, and what mark or bar do you need to get to? There are always going to be vulnerabilities in technology. Whether it's technology built by a Google or a Microsoft or an Alibaba, or technology that is built by Mattel or the toaster manufacturer, there are going to be vulnerabilities. But which ones are tolerable and which ones aren't? I believe that we have not yet had a sufficiently nuanced conversation about the role of incentives and disincentives relative to this environment. So bluntly, I don't believe a voluntary only standard is going to work. I also don't believe a strict liability only environment will work, nor will a regulatory environment only. It's going to need to be which incentive and disincentive works relative to the risk and harm that is of potential in this space. And I'll give an example. So for the toaster or the refrigerator problem space, maybe what you need to just do is have a voluntary standard for code scanning and patching. And people would rise to that standard. It can be enforced through procurement processes. That said, when you move up a little higher into, for example, the medical device world, the insulin pumps, in that environment, maybe we need to be thinking a little bit more about requirements and or liability. And in particular, when you move up to the mass scale life safety environment, so for example, automobiles, moving autonomously, maybe regulation is needed. What you see in that discussion, I'm not saying those specific scenarios are what we need, but rather, depending on the harm, you can think about voluntary and mandatory being used differently across a spectrum of harm. And I think that's really where governments and industry at various national levels need to go. The challenge is if you use too strong of an instrument for the environment, you will challenge innovation in a way that could harm a domestic economy. So for example, let's say if the EU was to go with strict software liability and the US does not, then what you would also see is that manufacturers who are operating out of the EU would be having to meet a higher bar and would be hindered. And so you've got to think about what is that interplay between the policy lever to drive change and the effect that it'll have on the innovation environment. And again, I think it's ultimately going to be a very wide spectrum relative to harm.
There seems to be quite an agreement in the chat when it comes to the range of initiatives rather than a single silver bullet that can help, and I guess everyone agrees on that. And I'm glad that we also touched upon openly on the accountability and liability of the corporate sector, especially with the new developments. There were other questions towards the artificial intelligence and questions about the functionality of patching and whether security by design can actually work and be imposed and so on. I don't think we have time to cover all of them. I guess we can take at least one or two more webinars to cover that. So I'll move on to the probably last big chunk of questions. We have another 10 minutes or something. And it relates to cyber arms and disarmament. So on one hand, we touched upon the arms already. There was a comment from Dragan that, or a question for you also, what do you think when it comes to the companies which are doing pen testing or even hacking tools, such as Wupen, Hacking Team, and the others, selling the vulnerabilities and exploits to the nation states? So this relation between the corporate sector, not your type of, but corporate sector and the states when it comes to actually buying the weapons which are coming from the technological market or even cyber crime market. And then there was a big chunk of questions related to that when it comes to possibility or a need for a cyber disarmament treaty, as Richard would put it. Christian said, to respond to that, how would we disarm? Because we actually, all the ICT tools have dual use technology. So what does it mean to disarm a cyber weapon? Can we do that? How do you start disarming Orox cells, especially having in mind the toasters and the Internet of Things that we mentioned? And then there was a question or a comment from Christine making a parallel to the nuclear proliferation treaty. How would you track cyber disarmament, whether it's feasible or not? And lastly, should we, any kind of a treaty takes a lot of time. The process of disarmament might take a lot of time, but how do we see it in practice taking place in context of all the norms and the processes that are being developed? Again, a big chunk of questions, but you can simply pick up what you resonate more to.
Yeah. So first of all, I appreciate the desire to have to look at disarmament as one of the mechanisms to help improve stability of cyberspace. I think when you look at the nuclear analogies, it's very natural to think about disarmament as a mechanism to help improve security. I think that the challenge that we see particularly relevant to that is that it's not just that technology is dual use, it's that technology itself is omni-use. It is used for commercial purposes, it is used for military purposes, it's used for research purposes, and it is going to be impossible, I said it, impossible to control access to technology. Access was the mechanism of control for the disarmament conversation, who can have particular types of uranium or who can have the different source components that could lead to nuclear weapons. Because of the omni-use and the broad deployment of technology and the very low level of skill that it takes to ultimately find a vulnerability and create an exploit, and those are two different things. The vulnerability is a component that an exploit uses to achieve its means. It is not possible to control access to technology, use of vulnerabilities. What we can do, and this ties to my earlier conversation, the question on incentives and disincentives, is reduce the number of vulnerabilities that exist in the ecosystem and think about how to make sure that we can respond effectively when something is being used. So if I harken back to the example, for example, from Stuxnet, it's as soon as that vulnerability, as soon as Microsoft saw it, we were able to quickly respond and patch. So unfortunately, I think there are a lot of really key insights to be taken from the nuclear world and forward into the cyber context. But when we look at whether you control access, whether you control effects, whether you control capabilities, it is our determination that the world is not going to be able to control access to technology, who the actors are that have them. That is even beyond states, non-state actors, criminal groups, everyone can do it. What we can do is have a good conversation about what are the effects that are acceptable and unacceptable, and how to improve confidence and capacity so that we can deliver against those effects.
Thanks. A couple of more minutes. There is ongoing discussion on all these questions. One of the questions was also the role of, or the need to fight the dark web and the criminal media when it comes to the trade of the weapons and exploits and so on. You can reflect quickly as well, but let me turn to the two maybe a little smaller chunks of questions. One was when it comes to the roles. You touched upon a lot on the roles of private sector. There's a question from Barbara initially, when you were considering the roles of the government, coinciding with the governmental sector and ministries and so on. To what extent do you think that actually a single ministry or a single department within the government should be dealing with these questions, cybersecurity, or to what extent they should go horizontally throughout the governments, which can sometimes lead to paradoxes or conflicts within the sectors and ministries and make the whole battle and negotiations and process simply ineffective. And the second one was related to the capacity building and development, and Philip Lark from the Marshall Center said, what priority recommendations do you have for wealthy like-minded nations and international organizations in the developed world to assist smaller developing countries, especially those like in Africa? Where would you prioritize strategic action and resources within those developing nations' governmental institutions?
So Vlad, I apologize. You might have seen me scrambling on this side of the line. I hadn't had my computer plugged in and it was about to die. Could you very briefly repeat the question just because I want to
No
make sure I
worries.
heard you? I apologize.
No worries. Two concrete questions. One was when it comes to the role of the governments in implementing cybersecurity measures, whether you think that it might be more functional that the governments actually have a specific dedicated ministry or institution dealing with cyber, or rather horizontally throughout the government with different sectors dealing with that, which can, on the other hand, lead to conflicts between the sectors and ministries. In many countries, it might be ineffective. And the second question was related to capacity building and development. What might be your priority recommendations when it comes to investments of developed countries and corporate sector into developing worlds, assisting them with capacity, especially those in Africa, and what could be strategic actions of priority for developing nations?
Okay, so very different questions, and I'll take each one. So the first question to me has to do with how governments are organizing to govern cyberspace, not govern cyberspace, but govern the security of their operations, their citizens, and their enterprises. And quite bluntly, I would just say whether you're talking about governments trying to figure out how to govern and deal and manage cybersecurity, or you're talking about enterprises trying to figure it out, it's honestly still emerging. I have seen models where there is centralization into a particular agency that includes diplomatic, intelligence, military, and economic capabilities. And I've seen models that continue to have cyber integrated across all of the different components. Now, there's strengths and weaknesses of each. What I think is an effective approach is you're going to have a good combination of both. There do need to be some functions that are centralized because you can think about having to bring together the different equities over time. I think that is particularly well suited for governments or companies who are still really trying to grasp the issue itself. Pulling resources together and focusing conversations can be quite helpful. In the long run, however, my personal belief is that cyber is part of everything. It's not going to be what is cyber conflict, but rather how is conflict manifest in cyberspace. It's not going to be that you need a technology department. The technology is horizontal. It cuts into everything. And by leaving it as a unique siloed function, and I'm not saying it's not a good approach right now, I'm just saying if I look 15 years out into the horizon, that centralization kind of makes it, we're special, we're different, we're unique, we're over here to the right, as opposed to recognizing that it is a fundamentally integrated part of all of the elements of national power, and it's a fundamental integrated part of all business functions and missions. And we're going to have to figure out how to normalize it over time. But I think right now, thinking about what is the right combination of centralization and what are baselines that can be applied there, and where you can add customization on top of that, that may be the best model for now, realizing that over time integration is going to be potentially more helpful. On the second part with regards to capacity building, I think there's a lot of opportunity relative to capacity building. It seems that this phrase, whether it's from government or frankly from industry, is oftentimes used, but the investments and the strategies don't seem to yet align with the importance of the priority. And so some of the things, for example, I know we're thinking about and that some other governments are thinking about is how to actually link what's going on in the development world with the cyber capacity building side. Now, historically, the development community has not wanted to engage in cybersecurity because it has geopolitical tensions involved in it. Yet at the same time, the development community has started to realize that what I just actually said earlier in governance, that technology is fundamental to development and that security is fundamental to realizing the benefits of technology, that you can't do one without the other. You won't have trust. And so some of the things that I think is, first of all, both governments and industry have a clear responsibility and duty to help with capacity building. We're helping to bring folks online. We need to be helping them with not just the skills for innovation, but also for security. At the same time, I do think we're going to have to think more about how to link development and capacity building so it's not one-off workshops and trainings, but rather an integrated part and a prioritized approach to what is the capacity building need in different environments relative to where they're at on the maturity cycle with technology adoption. I feel like that was a little bit of a squishy answer, but I think, again, we've got to focus on what are the priorities and move past workshops and into integrated long-term strategies for capacity building.
Thank you, Angela. I think it's actually an excellent wrap-up, and the underlying things when it comes to capacity building, that it should and needs to go beyond simple training. Capacity building is a process, takes time, it needs involvement of people, and we've been dealing with the explaining and showcasing that for years on our side. There is a lot more questions, a lot more discussions that we could cover. We don't have more time, unfortunately. We'll try to continue with these discussions. On the Digital Watch of the Geneva Internet platform, we are trying to follow the cybersecurity developments. We're also trying to follow the UNGG process. Next week, as I said, the UNGG is meeting again in Geneva. There will be a panel organized by Diplo in cooperation with the Swiss government and other partners extending this discussion. I know that Microsoft also has an event over there. I don't know if there is anything to share at this moment, Angela, or?
What I would say is for those governments who are members of the GGE, for one of the representatives from the 25, your government and its SME should have been invited to a luncheon. And for those who may be based in Geneva, certainly feel free to reach out to me. We'd welcome your interest and contributions in a luncheon dialogue on the 1st of December. And I think, Vlad, were people able to have my contact information as part of this, or should I send that to you and you can distribute it, or I can type it in the chat window? Would that help?
You can type it in the chat window, that's also fine.
There we go.
So if anyone wants to follow up with you, they can do it. Once again, we'll post the recording of the video of the webinar and the chat and the PowerPoint presentation. We'll need some time to do that with a bit of editing, but not cutting anything. So you will all be able to get back to the discussions and go through once again. With that, I would like to thank every one of you hanging with us for another for this hour. It was really exciting, and I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you, Angela, especially for waking up quite early. You're 6 hours behind the Geneva time, so it's quite early for you. But I hope the day will start. I'm happy to see you smiling, so I hope the day will start with a smile and continue that way. Thank you again for joining the webinar, and happy to see you in some of the next events by Diplo and the partners. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.